Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 5 of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Hope you're having a fantastic Thursday morning, and I'm excited. This is a great part in the story, and hopefully you're enjoying it. Clearly, Mr. Malfoy said, his pale eyes straying to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching apprehensively. The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink no lower. There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into the bookshelf. Dozens of heavy spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of, "Get him, Dad!" from Fred and George. Mrs. Weasley was shrieking, "No! Arthur, no!" The crowd stampeded backward, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please!" cried the assistant, and louder than all, "Break it up there, gents! Break it up!" Hagrid was wading towards them through the sea of books. In an instant he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an encyclopedia of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book and thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with malice. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "You should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet and straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core, the whole family, everyone knows that. No Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright, and Mrs. Weasley beside herself with fury. "A fine example to set for your children, brawling in public. What Gilderoy Lockhart must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him? As we were leaving, he was asking from that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work the fight into his report. Said it was all publicity." But it was a subdued group that headed back to the fireside at the Leaky Cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all of their shopping would be traveling back to the Burrow using Floo powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for the Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops work, but stopped quickly at the look on Mrs. Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses, put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to Floo powder. It definitely wasn't his favorite way to travel. The end of the summer vacation came too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but his month at the Burrow had been the happiest of his life. It was difficult to not feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he could expect next time he turned up at Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a sumptuous dinner that included all of Harry's favorite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks. They filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall for at least half an hour. Then it was time for the last mug of hot chocolate in bed. It took a long while for them to get started the next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they still had a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck tripping over a stray cauldron as he crossed the yard carrying Ginny's trunk to the car. Harry couldn't see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, 2 owls, and a rat were going to fit in one small Ford Anglia. He had reckoned, of course, without the special features that Mr. Weasley had added. "Not a word to Molly," he whispered to Harry as he opened the trunk and showed him how it had been magically expanded so that the luggage fit easily. When at last they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, "Muggles do know more than we give them credit for, don't they?" She and Ginny got into the front seat, which had been stretched so that it resembled a park bench. "I mean, you'd never know it was roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Harry turning back for a last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he'd see it again when they were back. George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run in for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked she'd left her diary. By the time they had clambered back into the car, they were running very late, and tempers were very high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. Molly dear? No, Arthur. No one would see. This little button here is the invisibility booster I installed. They'd get us up in the air, then we'd fly above the clouds. We'd be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be any of the wiser. I said no, Arthur, not in broad daylight. They reached King's Crossing at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get trolleys for their trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry caught the Hogwarts Express the previous year, but the tricky part was getting onto the platform 9 3/4, which wasn't visible to the Muggle eye. What you had to do was walk through the solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so that none of the Muggles noticed you vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed that they had only 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. "I'll take Ginny, and you two come right after us," Mrs. Weasley told Harry and Ron, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. "Let's go together. We've only got a minute," Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure that Hedwig's cage was safely wedged on top of his trunk and wheeled his trolley around to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident that this wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using Floo powder. Both of them bent low over the handles of their trolley and walked purposefully towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away from it, they broke into a run and crash! Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backwards. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thump. Harry was knocked off his feet, and Hedwig's cage bounced onto the shiny floor, and she rolled away, shrieking indignantly. People all around them stared, and a guard nearby yelled, "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" Lost control of the trolley," Harry gasped, clutching his ribs as he got up. Ron ran to pick up Hedwig, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty to animals from the surrounding crowd. "Why can't we get through?" Harry hissed to Ron. "I don't know." Ron looked wildly around. A dozen curious people were still watching them. "We're going to miss the train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself." Harry looked up at the giant clock with a sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. He wheeled his trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. "It's gone," said Ron, sounding stunned. "The train's left. What if Mum and Dad can't get back through to us? Have you got any Muggle money?" Harry gave a hollow laugh. "The Dursleys haven't given me pocket money for about 6 years." Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. "Can't hear a thing," he said tensely. "What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get back to us." They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of Hedwig's continuing screeches. "I think we'd better go and wait by the car," said Harry. "We're attracting too much attention." "Harry," said Ron, his eyes gleaming. "The car! What about it? We can fly the car to Hogwarts." But I thought, we're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency. Section 19 or something in the restriction of thingy. "But your Mum and Dad," said Harry, pushing against the barrier again in vain and hoped that it would give way. "How will they get home?" "They don't need the car," said Ron impatiently. "They know how to apparate. You know, just vanish and reappear at home. They only bother with the Floo powder and the car because we're all underage and we're not allowed to apparate yet." Harry's feeling of panic turned suddenly to excitement. "Can you fly it?" "No problem," said Ron, wheeling the trolley around to face the exit. "Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express." And they marched off through the crowd of Muggles, out of the station, and backed onto the side of the road where the old Ford Anglia was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk with a series of taps from his wand. They heaved their luggage back in, put Hedwig on the back seat, and got into the front. "Check that no one's watching," said Ron, starting the ignition with another tap of the wand. Harry stuck his head out of the window. Traffic was rumbling along the main road after, but their street was empty. "Okay," he said. Ron pressed a tiny silver button on the dashboard. The car around them vanished, and so did they. Harry could feel the seat vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel his hands on his knees, and his glasses on his nose. But for all he could see, he'd become a pair of eyeballs, floating a few feet above ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. "Let's go," said Ron's voice from his right, and the ground and the dirty buildings on either side fell away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole of London lay smoky and glittering below them. Then there was a popping noise in the car. Harry and Ron reappeared. "Uh-oh," said Ron, jabbing at the invisibility booster. "It's faulty." Both of them pummeled it. The car vanished. Then it flickered back again. "Hold on," Ron yelled, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. They shot straight into the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. "Now what?" said Harry, blinking at the solid mass of cloud pressing in on them from all sides. "We need to see the train to know what direction to go in," said Ron. "Dip back down again, quickly." They dropped beneath the clouds and twisted around in their seats, squinting at the ground. "I can see it," Harry yelled. "Right ahead, there." The Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet stake. "Due north," said Ron, checking the compass on the dashboard. "Okay, we'll just have to check it every half hour or so. Hold on." As they shot up through the clouds, a minute later they burst into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the cars skimmed the seas of fluffy clouds, the sky a bright, endless blue under the blinding white sun. "All we've got to worry now about are airplanes," said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time they couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plunged into a fabulous dream. This, thought Harry, was surely the only way to travel, past swirls and turrets full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartment, and the prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous faces when they landed smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn in front of Hogwarts Castle. They made regular checks on the train as they flew farther and farther north. Each dip below the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, replaced by neat green fields that gave way in turn to white, purplish moors, a great city alive with cars like multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. He and Ron had pulled off their sweaters, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of his seat, and his glasses kept sliding down the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now, and was thinking longingly of the train miles below them, where you could buy ice-cold pumpkin juice from a trolley pushed by a plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get on the platform 9 3/4? "Can't be much further, can it?" croaked Ron, hours later still, as the sun started to sink into their floor of clouds, staining it a deep pink. "Ready for another check on the train?" It was still right below them, winding its way past a snow-capped mountain. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove them upward again, but as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. "It's probably just tired," said Ron. "It's never been this far before." And they both pretended not to notice the whining growing louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker. Stars were blossoming in the blackness. Harry pulled his sweater back on, trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers were now waving feebly, as though in protest. "Not far," said Ron, more to the car than to Harry. "Not far now," and he patted the dashboard nervously. When they flew back beneath the clouds a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for a landmark they knew. "There!" Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedwig jump. "Straight ahead!" Silhouetted on the dark horizon, high on the cliff over the lake, stood the many turrets and towers off Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. "Come on," Ron said cajolingly, giving the steering wheel a little shake. "Nearly there. Come on." The engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from under the hood. Harry found himself gripping the edges of his seat very hard as they flew towards the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of his window, Harry saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. "Come on," Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clunk, a splutter, and the engine died completely. "Uh-oh," said Ron into the silence. The nose of the car dipped. They were following, gathering speed, heading straight for the solid castle wall. "No!" Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned into a great arc, soaring over the dark greenhouses, then the vegetable patch, and then out over the black lawns, losing altitude all the time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled his wand out of his back pocket. "Stop! Stop!" he yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield, but they were still plummeting, the ground flying up towards them. "Watch out for that tree!" Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crunch! With an ear-splitting bang of metal on wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing from under the crumpled hood. Hedwig was shrieking in terror. A golf ball-sized lump was throbbing on Harry's head where he'd hit the windshield, and to his right, Ron let out a low, despairing groan. "Are you okay?" Harry said urgently. "My wand," said Ron in a shaky voice. "Look at my wand." It had snapped, almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held on by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure they'd be able to mend it up at the school, but he never even got started. At that very moment, something hit the side of the car with the force of a charging bull, sending him lurching sideways into Ron, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. "What's happened?" Ron gasped, staring through the windshield, and Harry looked around just in time to see a branch as thick as a python smash into it. The tree they had hit was attacking them. Its trunk was bent almost double, and its gnarled boughs were pummeling every inch of the car it could reach. "Ah!" said Ron as another twisted limb pinched a large dent into his door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows from knuckle-like twigs, and a branch as thick as a battering ram was pounding furiously on the roof, which seemed to be caving. "Run for it!" Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against the door. But next second he had been knocked backward into Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. "We're done for," he moaned as the ceiling sagged, but suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. "Reverse!" Harry yelled, and the car shot backward. The tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roots creaking as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped out of reach. "That," panted Ron, "was close. Well done, car." The car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With two sharp clunks, the doors flew open. Harry felt his seat tip sideways. Next thing he knew, he was sprawled out on the damp ground. Loud thuds told him that the car was ejecting their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open. She rose out of it with an angry screech and sped off towards the castle without a backward look. Then dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. "Come back!" Ron yelled after it, brandishing his broken wand. "Dad'll kill me!" But the car disappeared from view with one last snort from his exhaust. "Can you believe our luck?" said Ron miserably, bending down to pick up Scabbers. "Of all the trees we could have hit, we had to get one that hits back." He glanced over his shoulder at the ancient tree, which was still flailing his branches threateningly. "Come on," said Harry wearily. "We'd better get up to the school." It wasn't at all the triumphant arrival they had pictured. Stiff, cold, bruised, they seized the ends of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope towards the great oak in front of the doors. "I think the feast has already started," said Ron, dropping his trunk at the foot of the front steps and crossing quietly to look through a brightly lit window. "Hey, Harry, come and look. It's the sorting." Harry hurried over, and together he and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in mid-air over four long, crowded tables, making the golden plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitched ceiling, which had always mirrored the sky outside, sparkled with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hats, Harry saw a long line of scared-looking first-years filing into the hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on a stool before the newcomers. Every year, this age-old hat, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted new students into the four Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry had remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago, and waiting, petrified, for its decision, as it muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds, he had feared that the hat was going to put him in Slytherin, the house that had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. But he ended up in Gryffindor, along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron had helped Gryffindor win the house championship, beating Slytherin for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place the hat on his head. Harry's eyes wandered past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, sat watching the sorting from the staff table, his long silver beard and half-moon glasses shining brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Harry saw Gilderoy Lockhart dressed in robes of aquamarine, and there, at the end, was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. "Hang on," Harry muttered to Ron. There was an empty chair at the staff table. "Where's Snape?" Okay, we're going to stop there today. Hope you have a fantastic day, and I look forward to joining us again tomorrow at 9 in the morning. Thanks.